So, Dr. Romero, first of all, I want to give you congratulations. I just saw that Christianity Today just tweeted out that you got your book, Brown Church, was just named as one of the five best books of 2020. So, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, I'm so happy about that. So proud about that. Thank you.
What's been the reception like?
So I think there's kind of different audiences that the book has resonated with. Um, my favorite audience is that of young Latinas, young Latinos who are really looking for a way to bridge their identities, the different identities that are often clash. So, you know, they're Christians, they follow Jesus, but they care about justice, they care about race, and they care about their God-given cultural background, and they find that it's hard to bring that all together in a solidified identity. And so one of the best responses that I get about the book is from young adult Latinos. It could be like in Ohio or something, and they say, "Oh, thank you for your book. I read it all night. Couldn't stop crying, and I finally feel like I belong, like I have a home, a spiritual home." That's the best. Some of the other responses, I'm really proud that the book also is resonating with my elders. I'm kind of in the middle. I'm not young, I'm not old. But like, so the older generation who's really wanting to connect, especially with young people, and kind of keep that connection. It's been also kind of been received there, and then finally with kind of traditionally white denominations who are wanting to either realize the importance of the Latino community and really want to learn how to take some of those first steps in engaging. And so those have been some of the main communities. I mean, there's more, but I can pause there.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that, especially hearing the sentiments of the younger generation, like, oh, I have like a home. I can see my place. I see my identity in the Christian church.
Absolutely. Yes. It's tough to navigate all that because it's like you're dealing with faith, you're dealing with religion, you're dealing with politics, you're dealing with race, you're dealing with gender. It's so hard to navigate all that. It's very difficult. And I find that many, probably millions of people now, and especially, again, not just Latinos, but millions of people are really in this current moment deconstructing their faith and reconstructing, trying to figure out how do you deconstruct your Christian faith in this moment of Trump and all this crazy ways in which Christianity and racism has been so indelibly, wedded together. People are trying to figure out, how do I make sense of it?
I don't know if you know the artist WHATUPRG. Have you heard of him at all?
Um, I'm so out of it when it comes to music. Like I'm just stuck in the 90s. But
Okay, I'm gonna email you some tracks. But he has a beautiful song called, well, his last album called Raul. He has a number of songs dealing with growing up Latino, and especially right now during this time of Trump, his views on immigration, the wall, separating families. And he has a song called 4 a.m., which is very, very powerful, where he talks about he's there with his mom and his little brother, and around, again, 4 a.m. is when the immigration comes and takes his dad away. And his little brother's crying, like, why are they taking dad away? He didn't do anything wrong. And through that song, he shares a story about his dad coming to America when he was 16 years old, try to have a better life, and ended up raising his family, and then, down the line ended up getting taken away from his family. And so he sings about that. And I'll send you the song. It's very powerful, but these are the issues that our young kids are facing with and dealing with right now.
Absolutely. Where and I think that music and art really can communicate in such powerful ways, beyond, just regular prose. And boy, I look forward to hearing that. I find also that unfortunately there's a lot of folks who are not listening and who they're digging their heels in, kind of like the 30% of Latinos who voted for Trump, if I could be honest, it's like, okay, but there's consequences to that. That's why so many millions of young people are leaving the church. I mean, and just beyond the Latino community, millions, yeah.
WHATUPRG talks about how, when talking to the church about this issue of immigration and his dad being taken away, like getting these these responses like, well, it's all going to work out for the good. Or you also have like the church like just supporting Trump and saying that Trump's a Christian, and so that's why you should support him. And the Bible talks about obeying your governing authorities. So you have like all these like proof texts that are just like causing more and more pain and trauma towards the marginalized, towards those families that have been broken up by certain administrations. And you're right. I think one of the key things that you just said is like, we're not listening. Like, there's so many issues where we're not listening. We're not showing an empathy to understand how these different policies are impacting people.
Absolutely. I think, like you said, like those proof texts are taken out of context, as your listeners would know. And there's more than 2,000 verses in the Bible that talk about God's heart for the poor, for immigrants, for all on the margins. 2,000, right? And I think those verses are just left out of the equation, in many church circles, which is crazy, right? Because I remember being brought up and hearing, if God says something once in the Bible, you better listen. 2 times, it's very important. 2,000 times, it's yeah, it's
That's
selective.
right.
It's selective reading of Scripture.
Yeah, and it's hard, like, because I have family members who are Latino and voted for Trump and support Trump, and I'm trying to have empathy and try to understand where they're coming from, and I totally understand why certain people do, but it's also really hard for me as I'm trying to talk to my elders in my family. I'm kind of curious, like, how do we navigate those conversations with our elders who are maybe voting a certain way that might be more hurting communities rather than helping?
Yeah, I mean, I think to start, I think that the church in the United States is going to be rebuilding for the next 20 or 30 years. Like, things are so dire. So I try to take like what's a long-term approach, medium term and short term, right? And in terms of family, like my Latino family, most probably of who voted for Trump actually too. I think I'm sympathetic, more understanding to certain reasons why they did so, and definitely not sympathetic to some of the other reasons. So I understand like my Latino family members who are skeptical or of like kind of like a far left political platform that talks about socialism, right? Because like say for example, like, and I'm Chinese too, right? But like my Chinese family, they fled as refugees from communist China because they were going to kill my grandfather because he was a pastor. But anything that smells of socialism, I get the skepticism of that.
Yeah.
I'm sensitive to, but when I find family members and I'm going to speak accurately. I don't want to like diss my family without unnecessarily. But I'll say there are certain members of the Latino community who identify with the racism of Trump, and that I will never accept. Like that's not okay. That is not okay, right? And a lot of that comes from like in Latin America, we come from a racist colonial background too, right? Where race, it was a different system than in the U.S., but it's very similar in Latin America, where it's like if someone was legally categorized as being Spanish, quote unquote, right? That was the equivalent of being called white in the United States, right? So during the colonial period in Latin America, if someone occupied that space of being called Spanish, you were viewed as culturally superior. You were viewed as upper middle class. You got all the rights and privileges of society. And if you were not considered Spanish, quote unquote, if you were considered anything else, especially if you were considered Indian, quote unquote, you were looked down upon. You didn't get all the privileges and so forth. And even though that formal legal system ended in Latin America a couple of hundred years ago, those attitudes linger. And I think that those attitudes are deeply still embedded in U.S. Latino communities. Absolutely, and so I fiercely object to any Latino who because of, and a lot of it is, it's not deliberate, but it's like it's transferring those colonial values from Latin America into the U.S. and saying, see, accept me, I'm white too. I don't like those immigrants either, right? Blah blah blah. And that, yeah, that is really troubling to me.
You're sharing your empathy. You're sharing you understand where it's coming from, but how do we then kind of like have those conversations and delicately discuss these things?
I think like it's hard. There's no easy answer. Um, I remember like a friend doing a seminar like a year ago, and it was about like how to maintain civility at the Christmas table or something, right? Something to that
Mm,
effect. And
yeah.
I think that that's kind of in essence what we're asking, right? Like, and I think that it takes time, first of all. I mean, I think it depends if our relatives are Christian, if they claim a Christian identity, or if they don't. And if they claim a Christian identity, well, then of course, I think gently appealing to that identity and to scripture and being like, oh, Theo or, Abuelito or, oh gosh, I know you said that and maybe you don't, I don't, maybe I don't think that you intend anything bad by that, but could I share with you? Like that just kind of it kind of rubs me the wrong way because of and starting gently like that.
Yeah.
And then kind of just a process. I think that's where I would start. I think that like hammering someone over the head, that
Hmm.
never, I mean, there's a place for that every once in a while, but usually it's not the most productive approach.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super hard. Like I'm like the worst person to even ask, talk about it because I don't do it. Like I'm just kind of like I just kind of like listen quietly, respectfully, and uh
Yeah.
and then afterwards talking to my wife about it, like I can't believe you know.
No, I understand. Yeah.
It's hard. It's really hard when you have loved ones who take a different side, and especially when you're having like those, we just had Thanksgiving, or you're having those family get-togethers, and certain people might just share their viewpoints very openly and loudly, and very very proud of it. And then, like you said, like how do we then kind of carefully kind of let me share with you my viewpoint and let's have a discussion about this. It's just it could be nerve wracking.
Oh my gosh, so stressful. Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's times where we might have family members that genuinely want to have a conversation, and there's times where some folks they just don't want to have a conversation, and I think there's probably little point in having a conversation in that moment if folks don't want to have it.
That's
I think
true.
I remember some kind of statistics, and I'm going to get the exact statistics wrong, but it's like, let's say you enter a room of like 20 people, and there's a controversial topic. There might be like out of 20 people, and I'm making these numbers up, but the point is the same. 5 people who are like, no matter what you say, they're not going to listen. They don't care what you have to say, right? There might be, 5 people who really agree with you. Like you don't, it doesn't take any convincing. And there's probably like 10 other people in the middle who might be willing to at least have a conversation. I think so. I think a lot of it is about that discernment. Is it the first group of 5, the last group,
Mm,
or the folks, in the middle?
mm. How long have you been like thinking about writing this book around church?
So, and I felt the calling to write something like this for over 20 years.
Oh, wow.
So God got a hold of my life when I was in law school. I was in Berkeley. I knew Jesus then. I was kind of a baby Christian, and I just wanted to make a lot of money, drive a Ferrari and everything. And then God really got a hold of my
Mm,
life then, and um, everything changed. I had that quintessential sort of born again experience. And as part of that changing, I finally made the connection between my faith and my professional calling. I felt like God knocking
wow.
on my heart, like God knocking on my heart and saying, "Hey, Robert, you never asked me what I wanted to do with your life." And so that led me into a discernment process that took many months. But at the end of it, I felt this calling to become a professor and to use that platform to address issues of race and Christianity. But that was when the journey began. I mean, that was like in 1997, right? And I mean, there's so many testimonies as to how God led me, to get my PhD after that, and to transform me, heal me, grow me in so many
Amazing.
ways, and then become a professor at UCLA, and it's lots of mini stories in between. But to directly answer your question, after getting tenure at UCLA about 7 or 8 years ago, I had been doing ministry for a lot of years with my wife, Erica. Erica and I, we've been doing a lot of ministry with activist students and trying to create that bridge between justice and Jesus. Um, but I had never engaged in like my academic research and stuff had nothing to do with the church or faith or anything. In fact, my research was about the Chinese in Mexico, kind of like my own background. And so my first book was about the Chinese in Mexico, which I love, but my ministry worlds and academic worlds were separate. After I got tenure, I was listening to a Lauryn Hill song, to talk about like old school music back in the day.
Yeah.
And in her MTV album, in this one interlude, it's interlude 5, she says, "I'm tired of leaving like 2/3 of myself outside of the door, right, when I make music," right? And she was referring to her Christian faith. And I said to myself, I'm tired of leaving 2/3 of myself outside of the UCLA door, right? And I thought that led me on the journey of thinking, well, how could I bridge in an appropriate way, for a public university, of course, in an appropriate way, how could I bridge, my ministry and activism and community organizing, pastoral work with my academic research? And that led me to really think about Brown Church. And one last thing I'll say is that Brown Church started from a practical theology question, namely, how can Christianity be relevant to these millions of Latino millennials who are leaving the church? And that led me to dig into the history, and that led to Brown Church.
What a beautiful story. And I mean, I think the timing is perfect because I think that all the research I'm seeing about Gen Y and this next generation, Generation Alpha, totally all in on social justice issues. I'm noticing even at my work as when I'm looking to hire people and I'm chatting with them, like the questions I'm getting now from the young talent versus questions I got 10 years ago are totally different. Like I'm getting questions now about, what is your company doing around X, Y, and Z? How are they handling this issue? How are they supporting the Black community after George Floyd was murdered? Like they're asking these questions that these are questions we never got before. And so I'm like very excited. Like people are like this young generation, I think is hyper curious, especially growing up and seeing the violence on TV, seeing the violence on social media, and especially what just happened with George Floyd, like seeing his murder on video going viral. And then now like looking at parents, looking at organizations, how is society handling these issues and what are we doing about it? And so to me, I'm very excited about this next generation coming up. Like I'm seeing a lot of passion for social justice. That's why I think your book is like the timing is perfect.
Thank you. That's very hopeful. And especially, when you're writing the book, you're like, oh, you want it to come out as soon as possible. And then it came out, I think I would say, in God's timing, when the moment is right. And thank you. It's very encouraging.
Yeah, I think I'm very hopeful for this next generation coming up. I think just with the things they're seeing in society, especially these last 4 years with Trump, and also just the pandemic and seeing the protests back and forth. I think we have a generation of kids coming up that are seeing all this, observing all this, and then wondering like, what's my place in this? I need to like take a stand. So it's it's an interesting period that these kids are growing up in. And I think your book is definitely serving a certain need so we can help to see identity for those of us that are in the Latinx community, to see also our role. Because that's also like an area that like I never got educated on that side of it. Like my understanding of the Christian church and Christianity was largely from Europe. Like the theology, the preaching, even like preachers like Spurgeon and George Whitefield all come from Europe. And a lot of times when I'm looking at church history, it's mostly white men. So it's very much male centric and also white centric. And so like unfortunately, like I'm very ignorant of like how the brown church has moved.
I can really relate to that too. I mean, even though I grew up in the Latino church and also in the Chinese American church, same thing. I mean, most of the books we read were just translations, or reiterations of white American, or European, thinkers. And there was some good stuff there, and I'm grateful. But we were not aware, like you said. I mean, I wasn't even aware, even like 10 years ago, I wasn't aware that there was this 500-year Christian justice tradition in Latin America and among U.S. Latinos that I call the Brown Church. Like that we've been reading the Bible and theologizing about justice and race and every other topic, salvation, for 500 years.
Hmm.
Justice is kind of a trendier thing now over the last 5-10 years in Christian circles in the U.S. So it was amazing for me to discover for myself that, oh my gosh, since the 1500s, we as Latin Americans, Latinos, we've been thinking about this stuff too. And so in the book, I talk about like how the Brown Church was born actually in 1511.
Wow.
1511, when there was again, I'm defining Brown Church as the Latin American Christian justice tradition. In 1511, in what is now like the Dominican Republic and Haiti and the Caribbean, there was a Dominican priest by the name of Montesinos. And also, it's important to note, 1511, of course, is 6 years before Luther nailed his famous thesis. So it's before the Protestant Catholic divide. But in 1511, this Dominican friar gets up on the Sunday before Christmas. So actually, kind of 119 years ago. I'm sorry, 519 years ago. Sorry. And he preaches to this audience of Spanish elites in the islands there. And he says, listen very carefully. The words I'm about to preach will be the strangest you ever heard. He says, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness. And then he says, you Spaniards, God gave you the opportunity to share about Jesus in love to these hundreds of thousands of natives that then lived in what we call the Caribbean, the so-called West Indies. But he said, God gave you the opportunity to share about Jesus in love, and instead you've enslaved them and you're killing them. And this is so horrendous. And if you don't repent, God's going to send you to hell. He preached that in
Wow.
1511,
Wow.
the first social justice sermon. And then the Spaniards, just like today, how if a pastor gets up and preaches a justice sermon, he gets all these emails and people get really mad.
Right. Right.
Spaniards, the Spanish elites did the same thing, got all mad at him. He came back the next Sunday and preached part 2. And that's when the Brown Church was born.
Wow, brilliant. Oh, I love that. And I loved also that he was addressing like the slavery issue that he was seeing.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's just horrible. I mean, and unfortunately, kind of his prophetic kind of words were not really heeded. And within probably 50 years after that, I mean, there was basically no indigenous population left in the Caribbean. Yeah, it's so horrible.
I had no idea that it went back to 1511. That's amazing. Yeah, before even Luther. And to have that preached, very much a social justice sermon being preached so early on, and sad that and tragic that, like you said, it wasn't heeded, and the abuse that happened after that. That's amazing. And again, this is like the history that I didn't know. So you really started diving into this about 10 years ago?
Even less, to be honest.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Maybe even like 7 years ago, I just started to kind of read into and this is where I go to an amazing Brown church called La Fuente Ministries in Pasadena, and my pastor, Marcos Canales, he's the one that introduced me to this. So he, having studied at Fuller, Centro Latino, he introduced me to the fields of Latino theology and Latin American liberation theology and some other types of fields, which I didn't even know existed. Of course, I had heard about liberation theology, but didn't know much about it. But he introduced me to the fact that, well, yes, there is liberation theology in Latin America, and that's very valuable. There's a Protestant expression of, that talks about similar justice issues called Misión Integral. And then there's U.S. Latina theology, born in the U.S., and he introduced me to that world. I just started to read those books he recommended and found out, oh my gosh, there's this history that's out there. I'm not the first person to talk about it, but it's for the most part, it's scattered. It's like you only read about it if you're a very specialized Latino theology scholar at a place like Fuller. But even if you're a seminary student at Fuller, you might never hear about this. So it's like it's like kind of this historical sort of experience that very few people know about. And there have been amazing scholars like Justo Gonzalez and others, many others, right, who have been writing about this stuff, for decades. But I guess if there's a contribution of the Brown Church was that I guess I could write a book. I had the privilege of writing a book that would pull it all together. Um,
Yeah.
and that would pull it all together with a framework that is attractive to some people, right? The framework of the brown church and brown theology and so forth.
Yeah, and I love how in your book you talk about it like you call it brown jazz.
Yeah, like pulling together, like, so another part of brown church is that I had to bring together my own background in ethnic studies, in Chicano Latino studies, right? Like in critical race theory, right? I had to figure how could I translate, because I'm attempting to write this stuff also for purposes of UCLA as well, not
Right.
just the church. So I thought, how could I use tools, academic tools, theoretical tools from ethnic studies, from critical race theory, merge them with Latino theology, liberation theology, and that's what I meant by the brown jazz, putting it all together. And
Yeah.
and like with jazz, like when jazz came out, it broke all the rules of music, right? I think brown church breaks all the rules too, right? I mean, I'm not a trained theologian. I mean, I am a pastor, but I'm like a hood pastor who just reads his Bible a lot, right? And has been in the trenches of ministry, right? And taught ethnic studies and CRT, like, so it was a very kind of raw attempt to, but in that sense, I wasn't bound by conventions, right? I didn't have to. I'm not a formally trained theologian, so I didn't even know how to do that formally if I wanted to. Same time, like, you know, um, I'm not trained in religious studies per se, so I don't. No one, there's no professor who guided me and said you have to study religion from this purely
Right.
neutral, objective lens, a blah blah blah, social scientific lens. I mean, I don't believe that's even true or possible, but and so I kind of just like put it all together and like it's like brown jazz, and hopefully the result is something that a lot of people can resonate with.
Well, I think what's also beautiful is that you're taking this from like a historical lens. Like you're a historian, so you're taking all the pieces and like trying to construct this history based on what you're seeing. So you're really like becoming like a journalist, investigative journalist, and historian going in to try to take these pieces and yeah, because you're not meant to be like a theologian, but you're just like grabbing here's what's being said, here's what's happening, and kind of telling that story.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, it's a history. It's like a church history.
Yeah. Were there any like putting together history, are there like certain like challenges you had, like any sort of biases or things you had to like watch out for as you're kind of constructing this?
Yeah, it depends upon like for what audiences. Like, so one of the biases that's in history of ethnic studies, which is I'm a historian of ethnic studies, right? There's a lot of great things about it, and it's what I am at my core. But there is a very strong bias against Christianity, and Christianity is viewed as simply the religion of the colonizers, right? With no redemptive value, right? And I get that, right? It's like, oh my gosh, for the last 500 years, probably 80% of Christianity has been colonial and just caused so much damage.
Mm,
Right? And I don't try to apologize for that at all, and I condemn that. All the
yeah.
horrors of intertwining European colonialism, American colonialism with Christianity and civil religion. That's horrible. But that's the only kind of accepted view, really, for the most part, honestly. And so I had to somehow make the case that there was this 20% of Christianity, right, in Latin America amongst U.S. Latinos that was on the front lines of justice, right? Indeed, my argument in the book is that this brown church history represents this important community cultural wealth of our Latino community, and that there is this spiritual capital that's part of this brown church history and community cultural wealth, and that's drawing from critical race theory. But and I'm saying, well, as Chicano Latino historians, we can't claim to understand the Latino community without understanding the role of religion, right? And also, how it has been a source of strength and community cultural wealth and spiritual capital. And so I had to kind of walk a delicate line, but it's not hard because I truly believe that, right? That, like,
Yeah.
yeah, 80% of it has been horrible and colonial, right? With some good stuff
Yeah.
mixed in there, I dare say. And there has been this 20% that is not discussed, has not been discussed really. where Christianity was a tool of empowerment amongst Latinos and Latinas.
Yeah, that's good. I like how you're approaching this, and I'm wondering, like, what advice do you have for those of us who maybe in conversation with those who maybe they look at the colonization, some of the trauma that the church has caused, and they don't see any sort of redemptive value in Christianity or the Catholic Church. Where maybe we're in a discussion with them, what would be some ways to like navigate those discussions?
For sure, yeah. I think first to totally recognize that trauma is real and horrible, and sometimes I see some Christians, they try to like almost apologize, and that's not the right approach. It's like if someone comes to you in your family and says, I experienced this horrible abuse by another family member, you don't try to like, oh, it's bad, but no, you say that is horrible, and you call it out, right? And I think that's the first thing is to, and I think that will just that alone is a huge step, right? And then I think then you say that actually, if you're interested, there's actually this other part, of history where where Christians have been on the front lines of justice, right? Precisely because of their faith, and that was actually who Jesus was, and that Christianity is actually, it's not a Western religion, it's from the East, right? It's an Abrahamic religion, from the East, and that Jesus himself, and this is where you have to deconstruct a lot of those colonial notions of who Jesus is, and then from there build upon, how that legacy has been expressed in history. But like in the book, for example, talk about how Latino theologians like Virgilio Elizondo and Justo Gonzalez and others have talked about how it was very significant that Jesus was from Galilee. Right? They say, taking our Latino cultural lens and reading the Gospels, we find it very important that Jesus was from Galilee, because Galilee was the hood of its day. Galilee was the hood. And when God came to earth, incarnated, in humanity, God chose to be from the hood, right? Galilee was a borderlands region in which Jewish, Greek, and Roman culture came together. It was a colonized region. Galilee was on the fringes of the Jewish community itself. The power was in Jerusalem, right? The political, religious, economic authority. People from Galilee were looked down upon as like, oh, they're Galilean, right? They speak with an accent, right? They're these kind of country bumpkins. They're these campesinos, if you will, right? And it's very significant and deliberate. Latino theologians would say that God came in Jesus Christ as a Galilean, right? And they frame that as, they call it the Galilee Principle, the Galilee Principle.
Oh.
Those that human beings reject, Virgilio Elizondo says, those that human beings reject, God chooses as God's very own. So beautiful. The Galilee
Beautiful.
Principle, right? So beautiful, right? I mean, we could just like drop the mic.
Yeah.
and kind of just leave right now on that, right? And it's like, so that it totally stands colonial Christianity on its head to see Jesus in his own historical context. And also the fact that Jesus did most of his ministry in Galilee, right? And Jesus was raised in Galilee. Jesus chose the leaders of his new movement. They were all Galileans, right? They weren't from the Beverly Hills or like Palos Verdes or like, Harvard of the day. They were these rabbinic school flunkies, right? Who were fishermen, right? Who didn't have the legit creds to fit into the institutions of their day. But in order to change the system, Jesus had to choose those who are outside of the system. And I think that conversation kind of decolonizing Jesus, right? That's a great place to start. And then from there, how has that same legacy of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus of Galilee, how has that borne itself out historically? And how did that get corrupted over time?
Oh, that's beautiful. I never heard that perspective on Galilee. I had no idea. I never heard that before. But that makes it so much more beautiful.
Yes. And that is a very distinctly Latino theology insight. It's part of this community cultural wealth, right, that I'm talking about. It's like that insight came from a Roman Catholic priest in the hood of San Antonio, Texas, ministering, right, in the Mexican American community, who went to get his PhD and said, oh my gosh, Galilee is like is like the barrio of San Antonio, right? So it's like that social location really matters, you know? And there's 500 years of that type of treasure there for us to dig into.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. And yeah, you think about like, you know, Christ could have been, stayed in the temple. He could have stayed in, the religious institutions and chose as his disciples other scholars, other Pharisees to kind of join up. Like these are the scholarly leaders. I'm gonna train them, and that's not where Jesus spent his time. He spent his time with the people, and then hearing this perspective of like he wasn't in the nicest area. He was in the Galilee, and that's where he chose to do his ministry and spend his time and to train up disciples. Like what a beautiful picture of the Christ like being with the marginalized.
Amen. Yeah, it totally just reorients our view of Christianity.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. I also wanted to ask you about Cesar Chavez. And I don't know, sadly, I don't know anything about Cesar Chavez's life at all. But I do know you address his life in your book and his impact on Christian spirituality.
Yes. So, Cesar Chavez, as your listeners will know, is probably arguably the most famous Latino, right, in the United States. He was a leader of the United Farm Workers movement, along with Dolores Huerta, and along with Larry Itliong, who was a Filipino farm worker leader. And the United Farm Workers was really famous, right, in the 1960s and 70s, because it was the first time that farm workers were able to organize themselves and be successful at it, right, and really kind of make some real grounds and concessions. And so, he's like an icon in the 1960s. There's like a stamp about him and all this kind of stuff. But most people have never heard about the role of faith in his life, the role of faith, Christian faith, right? So they've never heard, for example, that Cesar Chavez said, the only justice is Christ. But they've never heard that he said that the church is one powerful, important expression of God on earth, right? And no movement should ignore the power of the church, right? Things like that, right? And
beautiful.
People did not know also that what made his organizing so powerful was that he fused popular Mexican Catholicism. He fused that with Catholic social teachings about justice, with community organizing principles, right? And he brought those three together, and that's what made his movement so distinct and so powerful. Those famous march, right, to Sacramento from Delano took place during Lent, and they arrived on Easter morning and celebrated communion on Easter morning.
Oh, beautiful.
On the last day of the march. And the altar that they used was a farm worker truck.
Oh, so beautiful.
Right? So beautiful, right? His famous fast, right? That when the Kennedys came and broke his fast with him, right, was very famous. But it wasn't just a hunger strike; it was a fast. And Cesar Chavez said that this is a spiritual fast that I'm doing, right, to purify myself, right? Things like that, right? Like at the very core of the farm workers movement was Christian faith, explicit, right? And I believe, I'm biased, but I believe that was its unique power. And so I try to tell that story about the role of faith in the life of Cesar Chavez in the book as well.
That's so cool. Why do you think that we don't hear that story? I mean, I never heard that story about Cesar Chavez and the role of faith in his life.
I think like it depends upon the audience. So and I say this, I'm a community organizer, right? And in the world of community organizing, faith is oftentimes, not all the time, but it's oftentimes kind of looked down upon. And that's just a fact, right? So many people, when they write about his organizing, they just, in a very kind of biased way, just leave all that out, right? That's part of it. In ethnic studies, same thing, right? I mean, my own department is called the Cesar Chavez Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies. But the role of faith in his life is just, I mean, it's almost never discussed, right? And so I think in those circles, it's that biased. I think in white Christian circles, whether Catholic or Protestant, Chavez was viewed as a rabble-rouser, right? So even to this day, I've been told, if you go to the Central Valley, right, and speak with middle-class white folks, they'll be like, oh, Chavez, oh, that he was a horrible person, right? So I think that his faith story has not translated into kind of mainstream Christian life. And then you have, of course, within Protestant circles, a strong anti-Catholic bias, right? So because he was Roman Catholic, I mean, that would just be a hill too high for most people to climb, in Protestant circles as well.
Mm. Are you seeing like in the Latinx community more like Catholics and Christians working together? Like I feel like there is that separation that sometimes churches aggravate each other around this. But are you finding like more alliances happening between Protestants and Catholics, or is it you seeing like no change at all, just kind of everyone's in their own lane?
I think amongst young people, I find more willingness, and amongst justice people, right? So, like, I have dear friends or people who are becoming dear friends that are Roman Catholic, Latinx, justice folks, and they read Brown Church and we're like, yeah, we're all in, right?
Yeah.
um, and 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 I totally feel that way. I feel like Brown Church as an identity, it transcends. I'm not going to let these Europeans from the 1500s like separate me from like my beloved sisters and brothers who also love Jesus, right? That's the colonizers kind of thing, right? And so I think that for those of us who express our Christian faith with this ethos of justice, it's easier to bridge because we're like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to fight about those dumb things. Right? I don't. Like we love Jesus. Jesus died on the cross for us and rose again. And justice is God's heart. We follow Jesus. Let's do it. Right? Let's change the immigration laws. Right? Let's fight for. Let's stand with and fight with, immigrants who are losing their civil rights. And that translates also into like young people. Most young people don't care either. Right? They're like, so if I work with folks from, let's say, like InterVarsity, right, or groups like that, like Latinos, those divisions are much more permeable as well, I think.
Now, before we go, I see that guitar in the background, and I'm like, what don't you do? Because I know you're an author, you're an attorney, professor, UCLA. You founded Jesus for Revolutionaries. You're co-chair of Matthew 25 movement. How do you do all this work?
That's very kind, and I never set out to do it, and the hats change at different times and different emphases, and so things like with Matthew 25, we helped found it, and now we're moving to a board format. I'm on the board, and so kind of different seasons, different hats shift. But I think one thing I do want to emphasize is that like, my wife is a spiritual director, so she keeps me in line. But like, I keep really high boundaries. Honestly, most days I just work 9 to 5. I really do. Like ever since I've been a professor at UCLA for 15 years, and for 98% of the time I work 9 to 5. And most of the time, honestly, I haven't even worked on the weekends. Don't tell my colleagues that. But it's true. So it's like, I'm not one of those guys that like stays
awesome boundaries.
Because I'm a big believer in Sabbath, a big believer in email boundaries and in work boundaries. I want to do a great job. I want to honor my work, but it's not my identity. So, and there's seasons that are harder than others, and seasons where I'm stressed out like crazy too. Yeah. That's definitely true, but that balance, like, it's always been something that I don't know where it was instilled into me. Probably, I guess that's where my wife helps me a lot.
Has the COVID-19 impacted your schedule at all?
Honestly, like as a professor, it's made it easier, honestly, because I don't have to commute all the way to campus, and like. I don't live particularly close to campus because I can't afford it, but so as everything's online, so it's easier. And then like it was perfect as Brown Church came out at the end of May this past year. I mean, it was perfect, so I could just do all these kind of webinars and podcasts, just from the comfort of my own home. Again, I wish there wasn't COVID, but there have been those upsides.
Yeah. Are you already thinking about like your next book?
I have a few little books that are coming out. One book that we'll be working on with my friend Jeff Leo. is a book on CRT, on critical race theory and Christianity.
Oh,
So it's really in the ideation stage. It's not really kind of, but that's like probably the next big one. There's a few little ones, coming out. I'm thinking about the next steps really for how to leverage this platform that God has given, right, with Brown Church and to maximize it, And so one of the things I'm thinking about is like, oh, what about starting, for example, like a Brown Church research center, right? Or a Brown Church research institute or something
oh
like
yeah, right.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally.
And to look at, issues of race as they pertain to Latinos and the church, right? And so things like, what is the experience of Latinos, like an example, like Latino students at Christian colleges, right? Like pull together the best researchers, right? And say, okay, and there are my friends who are already doing this research, but to be able to kind of create if I might dare say so, like a hub where we can kind of pull that research together, right? And things like that. I had a friend who, hearing one of their research papers recently, and they were talking about how, he interviewed, for example, Latino students from several major seminaries throughout the United States, and he asked them about, what has been the experience of racial climate, right, and the experience of the cultural competence of their professors. Right? They're mostly white professors at the seminaries, and it was not a pretty picture, right? But kind of that kind of research to bring out, to stir change, I think, like Chicano studies mixed with Latino church history, and to pull in other researchers, right, sociologists and other folks who can kind of do that. So that's kind of one thought. Like I'm also looking to partner with different Christian organizations who can like take the Brown Church concept and extend it in their own lanes, right? Again, I've got a day job, but I can't do all this stuff, right?
Right.
But my friends, right? Like my friend and even mentor, Sandra Maria Van Oostel, for example, right? She has an organization called Chasing Justice, right? If she and her folks can take the concept and make it applicable in their context,
Right.
that's great, right? Or that kind of thing, right? Partnerships with different orgs that can do that. That's where I'm looking at, kind of like the next step.
That's awesome. So for those listening in that want to learn more or get involved, what's like the best way for them to like reach out to you? Because I know you're involved with Matthew 25, Jesus for Revolutionaries, and then you got the work with UCLA.
The usual places,
Okay.
Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. That's probably the best place to start.
Excellent. What I'll do, I'll put links on the blog for all those different resources so they know how to get in touch with you. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Romero, for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure. And I hope that we can continue our conversation and friendship. And I appreciate just your heart and the spirit of the podcast as well. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.